peacetime in Ukraine, apparently. But these families aren't heading home, they're leaving. And this is why. It's telling how no one flinches. Accustomed to war, but tired of having to live with it. The ceasefire may have largely held, but not here, near the frontline town of Debaltseve. This area is testament to the ferocity of a war about identity and sovereignty. A battle that pits a Western-leaning government against a rebel army that turns to its Russian neighbour. With more than 5,000 people killed and 1.5 million displaced, it'll be difficult for either side to forgive or forget.
Too much blood's been shed on both sides. 2 or 3 generations need to pass to even start to forget about this. Too many people have suffered and been killed on both sides.
This was a frontline town in World War II. Imagine seeing this twice in one life. 87-year-old Matrona says she hasn't got any power or bread. Her daughter just thanks God they're still alive. Rebel leaders say they'll stick to the ceasefire in most places, but not here, an area they insist isn't covered by the peace deal.
So this is day one of the ceasefire in the Ukrainian war. And while it appears to be largely holding in many frontline positions, that doesn't seem to be the case here. We're not far from Debaltseve, which is a key frontline area that's been heavily fought over by both sides. And for the entire time we've been here, we've been hearing the sound of fighting. It appears to be the sound of mortars, perhaps shells. It's difficult to know which side is firing, but it does show quite how fragile this ceasefire really is.
If progress can be made elsewhere, then perhaps Ukraine can move forward. For now, it's peace of sorts, but with deadly imperfections. Ian Pannell, BBC News, Ugliagorsk.
A new day arrives in eastern Ukraine. At a checkpoint outside rebel-held Donetsk, residents rejoice hours after a new ceasefire begins.
In general, I feel relief after the ceasefire, finally. But so far, I do not know what will happen next.
Guns fell abruptly silent at midnight, though pro-Russian rebels aren't holding their breath.
Ceasefire? I doubt it. Maybe 2-3 days and they will start shooting again. This is all for show.
Ukrainian troops are not hopeful either. These troops stationed near Debaltseve say rebels still have their sights set on the strategic city.
We don't shoot. Can you hear it? But there are some individual explosions from the other side. They keep shelling with some intervals into somewhere close to here.
A pro-Russian rebel had already told Reuters that the truce would not apply to the city, where Ukraine's army has been encircled. Volleys of artillery were still being heard in the area in the morning, giving many reason to believe the ceasefire won't last long.
Few signs of a ceasefire in Debaltseve. The Ukrainian-held town has been at the center of the battle for control in the east. On the outskirts of the town, these separatist fighters are holding their ground, saying they are protecting Europe from fascists. The U.S. doesn't see it that way, issuing warnings that there are grave concerns about the situation and calling on separatists and Russia to halt all attacks immediately. Fighting subsided in much of eastern Ukraine under a ceasefire that came into force Sunday. A deal was reached last week in marathon talks involving the leaders of France, Germany, Russia, and Ukraine. Now German Chancellor Angela Merkel is calling the situation, quote, fragile, saying the way forward is, quote, a difficult path. Rebels said they had no intention of observing the ceasefire in Debaltseve, where they have been advancing since January and now have a Ukrainian unit all but encircled.
This is what a scorched earth policy actually looks like, barely recognizable for what it is. Donetsk International Airport. A symbol of the searing intensity of the war in Ukraine that's supposed to have stopped. A battle that pitches a Western-leaning government against a rebel army that turns to its Russian neighbour. So this is day 2 of a shaky ceasefire, and heavy weapons are supposed to be pulled back. But that isn't what's happening here. The rebel defense minister says he'll only pull his forces back when he has proof that the Ukrainians on this front line have withdrawn theirs. But the issue that threatens this peace deal isn't that the guns haven't pulled back here, it's that they're still firing. This is supposed to be day 2 of the ceasefire in eastern Ukraine, and as we've been hearing yet again, the peace has not settled in. We've been hearing the consistent sound of artillery fired. There's another one. Most of it appears to be outgoing. But what the people of the Donetsk People's Republic are saying is that they're suppressing fire.
Stay together. Run!
The Ukrainians insist they haven't broken the truce, accusing the rebels of shelling their own territory.
Непонятно, чего делают. Ну вот вы слышите сами.
But that's firing out.
Нет, входящий и исходящий.
No, it's in and out. The defense minister says he's trying to stop the enemy from firing at their positions.
Мы работаем только на.
The last effort to stop this war failed. Today's peace deal has held in most places, but there's a clear risk that what we're watching is history repeating itself. Ian Pannell, BBC News, at Donetsk International Airport.
10 kilometers from Debaltseve lies this small town, Vuhla-Hursk. It was captured by rebels earlier this month. Local residents now believe the Ukrainian army may try to take it back, although there's no evidence of an offensive. This local resident, Victor, says we don't feel the ceasefire. They've started an offensive on Vuhla-Hursk yesterday with 36 tanks and 1,500 people across the fields. What kind of ceasefire is it if they're on the offensive against us, he asks. A Reuters reporter near the front line said at least 6 tanks as well as armoured personnel carriers could be seen in nearby woods. All shops are closed and everything is destroyed, says local resident Alina. And the roof of my parents' house was swept off. So we live as we can and can't wait until it's all over. We cannot bear these blasts and shots anymore, she says. Reuters said pro-Russian rebels pounded encircled Ukrainian forces on Monday. Kiev said it would not pull back heavy guns while the truce was being violated.
Despite Washington's repeated assurances that none of its soldiers will be entrenched in a long battle with Islamic State in Iraq, the U.S. seems to be getting drawn directly into combat with the jihadists. In fact, let's show you some territory on the maps here that's currently being controlled by the radicals, even though after months of coalition airstrikes, you can see the black area right here bordering Syria and Iraq. The Pentagon now says it's creating a military base in Erbil, the capital of the northern Kurdish region. The idea is to increase its presence there. Meanwhile, Islamic State fighters have attacked an army base in western Iraq. We're talking about just over to this side over here. It's where American Marines have been training Iraqi soldiers. In fact, the nearby town of al-Baghdadi, which is right here along the coalition borders, 8 kilometers away, in fact, from that outpost, was captured by militants. Latest report now from Washington with RT's Gaine Chichikan.
If you are confused about the Obama administration's position on the use of ground troops in the war against the Islamic State militants, you're not alone. This is President Obama less than 6 months ago.
The notion that the United States should be putting boots on the ground, I think, would be a profound mistake, and I want to be very clear and very explicit about it.
He's no longer clear and explicit about it.
I would be prepared to order our special forces to take action.
President Obama is now asking Congress to authorize the use of U.S. troops in ground combat missions, though in quote-unquote limited circumstances, and not in what is called enduring operations.
Enduring, what's enduring? Does that mean they can engage in some firefights on occasion, but not too many of them? What does enduring really mean?
But the Obama administration does not want to clarify.
Well, what we have...
The language is fuzzy, is it not?
Intentionally so. And the intent
intentionally
is...
so. The
yes.
language is intentionally fuzzy.
Yes, Jim, because we believe it's important that there aren't overly burdensome constraints that are placed on the commander-in-chief.
One indication of how enduring the operation may turn out to be is the U.S. plan to build a military base in Iraq's Kurdistan, according to Kurdish authorities. Currently, there are already 2,600 U.S. troops in Iraq. On Friday, the Islamic State jihadists have attacked the base, which houses more than 300 U.S. troops training Iraqi forces.
Most, if not all, of the ISIS militants were wearing Iraqi uniforms.
The attack was repelled. But what if it wasn't? What if U.S. troops had died?
The presence of any Americans on the ground has the potential, the danger of becoming a tripwire that gets us more deeply involved.
Something that President Obama says he doesn't want.
I'm convinced that the United States should not get dragged back into another prolonged ground war in the Middle East.
But the war against the Islamic State militants may turn out to be one. For the Obama administration, the question is no longer whether there should be U.S. boots on the ground, but rather what kind of boots and in what kind of operations they should be deployed. In Washington, I'm Ganesh Chekyan, RT.
Now, meanwhile, in Libya, Islamists with ties to Islamic State have released a new video purporting to show its fighters beheading 21 Egyptian hostages. The captives were all Coptic Christians kidnapped during 2 raids in eastern Libya at the end of 2014 and the beginning of this year. Now, President El-Sisi has said Egypt has a right to respond and called an urgent meeting of the country's top national security body to discuss what measures to take.
On roads and highways in every province of Egypt, armed vehicles like these have been deployed. Their job is to keep public buildings and property safe and secure. Egypt is feeling under threat. It carried out airstrikes in Libya on Monday in retribution for the apparent killing of 21 Egyptian Christians in a video posted by a group linked to the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. This airstrike hit the Libyan city of Derna. The military says it was targeting positions held by ISIL-linked fighters, but the attack also killed civilians, including children. The mission was carried out with the support of the UN-recognised government in Tobruk, one of 2 rival governments vying for control of the country. The self-declared defence minister backed by the Tobruk government, General Khalifa Haftar, says areas of the eastern city of Benghazi and Sirte, where the Egyptian hostages were first seized, were targeted.
If there were any terrorist groups on the Egyptian side and we were able to hit them, we wouldn't hesitate to fight them. And it's the same thing that applies for Egypt. For groups that commit such crimes, borders aren't going to be an issue.
But Libya's political leadership is fractured, and the rival government, the National Congress, which is based in Tripoli, criticised the Egyptian airstrikes.
This horrible assault and this terrorism that's been conducted by the Egyptian military represents a violation of sovereignty in Libya and is a clear breach of international law and the UN Charter.
The airstrikes came just hours after Egypt's President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi warned it would respond to the killing of the 21 men. Egypt's military is already trying to wipe out what it calls terrorist groups in the Sinai Peninsula in the east of the country. It's not only Egypt that is being threatened by the rapidly deteriorating security situation in Libya, but European nations as well. ISIL has made a direct threat against Italy. The Italian embassy in Tripoli has now been evacuated, and along with Egypt and France, Italy is calling for action by the United Nations. Caitlin McGee, Al Jazeera.
Western concern is growing that the radical group ISIL, Islamic State, is exploiting the discord of two separate Libyan governments struggling for control of the country. The attack on the luxury hotel Corinthia a little over 2 weeks ago in the center of the Libyan capital Tripoli was claimed by the Islamist militants. They killed 9 people, among them 5 foreigners. This comes 4 years after NATO forces helped rebels in a Libyan civil war remove the strongman of 4 decades, Muammar Gaddafi. The chaos of rival groups battling each other means ISIL has been able to expand its military base against Egyptian forces. The Egyptian airstrikes against ISIL camps and weapon stores in Libyan territories targeted Sirte, Ben Jawad and Derna. Egypt faces similar deadly confrontations in the desert to the east. Militants based in Libya have made contact with Sinai Province, a group operating from Egypt's Sinai Peninsula that has changed its name from Ansar Beit al-Maqdis and pledged allegiance to ISIL. Egypt, the most populous Arab state, has not previously taken part directly in the US-led airstrikes against Islamic State targets in Iraq and Syria, focusing instead on the increasingly complex insurgency within its own borders. Jordan is a key coalition participant. Its warplanes stepped up attacks against the jihadists in Syria after ISIL captured one of its pilots and burned him to death in a cage, renaming their air operations after him, calling the mission Martyr Mu'adh. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are in the air striking at ISIL as well, followed by Bahrain. On the ground, only the northern Iraq-based Kurdish Peshmerga have stood against ISIL. Cairo's call on the US-led coalition fighting Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, to include Egypt's neighbor Libya, highlights how the militant group is expanding around the Arab world.